There's a moment before the cruelty. A moment when it genuinely looks like the most beautiful idea anyone has ever had. You've seen the face of someone in that moment. Maybe it was a student, someone you raised, someone you taught. Maybe it was a colleague you'd worked alongside for 15 years. Their eyes change. Something lights up. They've found it. The framework, the movement, the community, the analysis that explains everything. The inequality, the suffering, the injustice that has always nagged at the edges of their conscience. They've found the people who take it seriously, who are willing to actually do something about it. And for a moment, if you're honest, you understand the pull. Because the dream isn't stupid. The desire for a world without cruelty, without exploitation, without the grinding unfairness that marks ordinary life, that desire is not pathological. It's almost the best thing about us. The question Aron spent his life asking wasn't whether the dream was beautiful. He knew it was. The question was what the dream does to people once they've decided it's not just beautiful, but inevitable. Not just good, but historically necessary. Once they've decided that history itself is on their side, that question is what this is about. Not a warning, a mechanism. By the time we're done, you'll have the name for what you've been watching. Named things can be responded to. Unnamed things only wound. There is a city, a year, and a scene that might be the cleanest entry point into all of this. Berlin, 1933. Raymond Aron was 27 years old, on a fellowship at the French Institute, watching German intellectual life from the inside. He was not watching the obvious villains. He was watching the university, the lecture halls, the faculty clubs, the student associations, the most credentialed, most rigorously trained, most intellectually sophisticated society in the modern world. And what he watched was this. Those students, the best educated cohort in Europe, were not being dragged into National Socialism. They were rushing toward it. The dream of national rebirth, of historical destiny, of a purified Germany that would correct the humiliations of Versailles. This was not the dream of the ignorant. It was the dream of people who could cite Hegel and Fichte while they burned books. Aron took that in, and the thing it installed in him, the thing that would define everything he wrote for the next 50 years, was not cynicism. It was a specific, precise suspicion that intellectual sophistication is not a defense against political intoxication. It might even be a vulnerability, because the educated mind is very good at constructing arguments for what it already wants to believe. He left Berlin with a question that Paris in 1955 would force him to answer. What exactly is the structure of the dream? Why does it grip intelligent people? And, most importantly, what does it do to them after it takes hold? The answer he published in 1955 was called The Opium of the Intellectuals. The title was a provocation, a deliberate inversion of Marx's line about religion being the opium of the people. Aron's argument was that Marxism and the broader revolutionary left of mid-century Paris had become, in every functional sense, a religion. Not a metaphor for religion, a religion. It had a prophet Marx, whose texts were sacred and interpreted with the exactitude of Scripture. It had an elect people, the proletariat, whose historical mission was as certain as salvation. It had an apocalypse, the final crisis of capitalism, that was always arriving, always just over the horizon, always postponed but never doubted. And it had a salvation on the other side, the classless society, the end of exploitation, the perfected world where the contradictions of history finally resolve. Aron wasn't saying the people who believed this were stupid. He was saying they were performing the functions of faith while believing themselves to be doing science. They were constructing a closed system, one where every piece of contrary evidence could be explained, absorbed, and neutralized without threatening the central belief. The Soviet Union isn't living up to the ideal? The ideal is still correct. The Soviets are in a transitional phase. The revolution devoured its own people? Necessary sacrifices. History moves in dialectical stages. This is what he meant by secular religion, not the content, the structure. A closed explanatory system with a perfect destination, guided by a class of people who know the direction of history, resistant to disconfirmation and hostile to doubt. Here's the thing about that structure. Once you name it, you start to see it detach from its original content. The Marxist labels can be stripped away. The mechanism beneath them stays, and the mechanism has a logic. A single, unavoidable consequence that Aron identified, and that history has confirmed every time the structure activates, regardless of what it's wearing. If your society is going to be perfect, you need a definition of perfect. That definition will describe a type of person, The new man, the true revolutionary, the faithful comrade, the ideologically aligned citizen, the fully awake member of the community. And the moment you have a definition of the perfected person, you have, automatically, a definition of the imperfect one. The deviant, the holdout, the one who doesn't quite get it, the one who understands intellectually but doesn't feel it in the right way, the one who asks the wrong questions. This is the mechanism. Not a design choice, not a failure of leadership, a structural consequence. The purity test is not something that goes wrong with a utopian project. It is what a utopian project produces. Logically, inevitably, the way a proof produces its conclusion. And here is what confirmed this for Aron at the most brutal possible scale. Look at Moscow in 1936, the show trials. The men being prosecuted were not counter-revolutionaries. They were not monarchists, not fascists, not Western agents. They were the original Bolsheviks. The men who made the revolution, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, men who had given their lives to the cause, who had suffered exile, prison, and poverty for it, who believed in it with everything they had, and they confessed, in open court, publicly, to crimes they almost certainly did not commit. Confessions extracted not only through torture, but through a particular psychological operation. The argument that even if these specific charges were false, their confession served the party, served history, served the revolution, and therefore was, in a deeper sense, true. The revolution's logic had consumed them so completely that they accepted the logic that required their own destruction. This is what the purity test does at scale. But Aron was not only concerned with scale, he was watching it operate in his own city, in his own circles, at a level that produced no bloodshed at all, and was, in certain ways, more instructive because of it. Wait, because this is where the mechanism reveals something about your own life that Moscow never could. When The Opium of the Intellectuals was published in 1955, it caused a rupture in Parisian intellectual life. Not because Aron was unknown. He was already a significant figure, a philosopher trained at the same institutions, among the same people as Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, and the rest of the left-bank establishment. He wasn't an outsider throwing stones. He was a colleague, a peer, someone who had sat in the same seminars. That made it worse. What followed was not a debate. It was not a serious engagement with Aron's arguments, though his arguments were, by almost every subsequent assessment, correct. What followed was social. People stopped calling. Invitations dried up. The intellectual circles that had been open to him quietly closed. Sartre, who ran the most influential literary and political journal in France, did not publish a rebuttal. He simply treated Aron as someone who had placed himself outside the conversation worth having. Aron later described what this felt like, not with bitterness, but with a kind of analytical detachment that is almost more unsettling than anger would have been. He said he had become, in the language of the very movement he was analyzing, a heretic, not through violence, not through any official mechanism, through the withdrawal of fellowship. They didn't send anyone to the gulag, they just stopped calling. And in the most intellectually sophisticated city in the world, in 1955, that was enough. This is the climax of the mechanism. And it's not in Moscow, and it's not in 1937. It's in Paris in 1955, in a culture of people who would have been horrified to compare themselves to Stalinists. People who believed, sincerely, that they were on the side of freedom and human dignity. People who were enacting the purity test without knowing it had a name. Because the structure doesn't care what it wears. Strip off the Marxist labels. What remains? A closed explanatory system. And elect people who understand history's direction, a definition of the perfected person, and automatically, necessarily, inevitably, a definition of the one who doesn't qualify. The clothes change, the machine doesn't. If you want to go deeper, if you want the actual field kit for spotting this in real time, before it's already consumed someone you love, I've built one from Aron's frameworks directly. It's a short PDF called the Intellectual's Survival Kit. 7 frameworks drawn from Aron's work, designed for printing and pinning up. The Secular Religion Checklist, the Liberty Equality Antinomy Map, the Institutional Capture Radar, and 4 others, each one with a sample conversation showing it in actual use, not to win arguments, to name what you're watching before it names you. The link is in the description. Now here is the part that Aron himself never lived to address directly. but that his framework describes with uncomfortable precision. You do not need a political party to run this machine. You do not need a state, a revolutionary vanguard, or even a coherent ideology. You need a dream, a definition of perfect, and a community of people who have agreed, at least implicitly, that those who don't share the dream are not simply mistaken, they are a problem. Think about what has happened in certain American universities over the past 2 decades. Faculty surveys, documented by organizations like FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, consistently show that significant percentages of faculty self-censor. They don't teach certain arguments, don't assign certain texts, don't ask certain questions, because they've accurately perceived that doing so would cost them socially. Not legally, not formally, socially. The same mechanism that operated in Paris in 1955 operates in academic departments in 2026, producing not gulags but dry invitations, not show trials but quiet exclusions. This is the narrator's reading, not something Aron literally addressed. But Aron's framework predicts it, because his insight was structural, not historical. He wasn't describing Stalinism. He was describing what happens when a closed, explanatory system takes hold of a community, any community, and begins sorting its members into the qualified and the unqualified. You've watched this happen. Maybe it came for the church you've attended for 30 years, and you noticed one Sunday that the language had shifted, that the sermon was speaking in categories that felt borrowed from somewhere else, as if the gospel had been translated through an intermediary you didn't recognize. Maybe it came for the family dinner table, when the conversation that used to cover everything became a conversation that could only safely cover certain things. Maybe it came for a colleague, a neighbor, a child, and you watched them change not into a bad person, but into a certain kind of person. One who had accepted, quietly, that the truth of their community was not a question to be examined, but a loyalty to be performed. You weren't wrong about what you were seeing. You were watching the machine run without knowing its name. Aron's answer to all of this was not despair. That's the thing people most often miss about him, because his work is so clear-eyed about the costs of illusion that it can read as cold. It isn't. His alternative wasn't cynicism, and it wasn't indifference. It was something he called, in different places and different ways, the politics of the possible. And what he meant by it is harder than it sounds. Constitutional democracy, the messy, pluralist, argument-driven, always incomplete thing that most of us grew up inside, is not defined by its perfection. It is defined by its acceptance of imperfection as a structural feature. It builds in disagreement. It institutionalizes the opposition. It assumes that no one has the final truth about history's direction, and it constructs the rules of public life around that assumption. That is not a concession of defeat. It is, Aron argued, the hardest and most sophisticated political achievement in human history, not because it produces perfect outcomes. It doesn't. But because it produces the only environment in which the permanent human argument about justice and the good life can be conducted without one group burning the others. He called his own position at the end of his life a form of modest hope. Not optimism. He knew too much for optimism. Not pessimism. He refused the comfort of it. Something cleaner and harder. The recognition that the free world he had inherited was imperfect, was not permanent, and was worth defending with open eyes. He was 67 years old when he wrote that. He had watched the century's worst ideas run at full power. He had been ostracized for being right. He had watched colleagues he respected spend their intellectual lives in the service of systems that required lies to sustain themselves, and then outlived those systems and watched those colleagues mostly refuse to reckon with it. And what he offered at the end was not a rallying cry. It was something quieter and more lasting. The sober relief of someone who had seen the whole arc, named it clearly, chosen the harder position, and found it, in the end, livable. That's what you have now. The mechanism, the name, the arc. The dream of a perfect society isn't going away. It never does, because the desire it draws on is real. But you know now what the dream produces, structurally, logically, every time it takes hold of a community. The moment when argument gives way to purity, when the question, "Are you right?" is replaced by the question, "Are you with us?" And you know that this moment doesn't require a revolution. It requires only a definition of perfect and a community willing to enforce it. Aron watched that moment arrive in Berlin in 1933, in Moscow's show courts in 1936, in the Parisian dinner parties of 1955. He named it at personal cost. And 70 years later, the name still works. The question that remains, the one worth carrying past this video, is quieter than the mechanism. It's this: what do you do with clarity once you have it? Not to win arguments, not to prove you were right, but to stay in the conversation, with the people you love, with the institutions worth defending, with the country you actually live in, without losing either your honesty or your warmth. Aron managed it. Not easily, but he managed it. Tell me about the moment when you first realized the conversation had changed. In your church, your family, your workplace. Not the politics of it. The moment. I read these. The Intellectual's Survival Kit, 7 frameworks from Aron that work in any argument, is linked in the description and pinned in the comments.